Hi everyone, welcome to LEAP UofT's Teach-In and Open Meeting on the Just Recovery. My name is Christine, an organizer with LEAP UofT and your moderator for this afternoon. It's okay, time is fake. LEAP UofT is the University of Toronto chapter of the global climate justice organization, the LEAP, which works on environmental justice through the intersectional, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial lens. Alongside running the fossil fuel divestment campaign at UofT since about 2017, our campus group also organizes rallies, solidarity actions, and educational events like this one. We're also an action group with OPERC Toronto, which supports a variety of environmental and social justice organizations on and around campus. If you're a UofT student interested in doing direct climate action work or interdisciplinary educational events like this, don't hesitate to reach out. We have regular meetings every second Friday for the rest of the summer, beginning with this Friday, July 24th, as well as a book club that meets every week and other webinars like this one. This teach-in is also being co-hosted by UCLit Sustainability. If you're a UC student interested in doing climate justice work, you can join UCLit Sustainability by contacting their social media pages, UCLit Sustainability UofT on Facebook, at Sustainability UCLit on IG, or sending them an email at sustainability@uclit.ca. All right, now here's our format for this evening. First, Julia and Carmen, two LEAP organizers, will give an introduction to the Just Recovery. Next, we will hear from three speakers, Diana Barrero, Justin Holloway, and Anjum Sultana, who will talk about their work, basically what they've seen or not seen the university do for members of our community during the pandemic and the organizing they've been doing around the pandemic response. After, we'll have a short question and answer session. So if you have any questions, just type them in the chat and we'll probably get to them right after the speakers speak. And then there'll be a short 5-minute break we're hoping at 6:10 p.m. The second half will consist of a discussion of the 6 pillars of a just recovery in relation to campus organizing in small breakout groups. And then we'll have a report back and a large group discussion for the last 25 minutes. We'll also have several shorter music breaks where we put up links to donate to BIPOC-led organizations and projects. We encourage those who have the means to take that time to give if you're able to. And just going over some housekeeping things. Since we're not using the Zoom webinar settings tonight, we kindly ask everyone to please keep your audio and video off for the first hour until we're in the breakout rooms. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat, and our chat moderator, Sophia, if you want to wave, I don't know if they can see you, we'll make a note of them. We'll either answer them in the chat or save them for the Q&A session. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, you can message our tech mod, Maya. Except during the 3 speaker presentations, the slide deck will always be visible on screen share through Joe's/Julia's screen. If you're seeing the slide deck instead of a speaker talking, you can click the view options. I believe it's on the top right of your screen to escape the screen share. And the panel portion of this teaching will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel later with closed captions available. The link to our YouTube channel will be posted in the chat right now. And we'll also post in the Facebook event page for this webinar when the recording is uploaded. And with that, we welcome viewers to this teach-in. We're grateful that with video conferencing, we're able to bring this teach-in to a wider audience of people from many places. Before I talk about Toronto, which is where our group is located, I want to give a brief history of my relationship to the land I'm currently on, which is Vaughan, Ontario, which is a suburb just north of Toronto. It's not relevant, but anyways, my mom's family immigrated to Canada from Laos in 1984. Living in Toronto until I was born in 1998 and my brother born was in 2000. After my brother was born, my parents moved to the suburbs of Vaughan to achieve the coveted dream of home ownership. This land in Vaughan has been inhabited by the Mississaugas of the Credit River, the Shinabek, the Wendat, and the Métis. The most notable feature of Vaughan may be its intersection with the Carrying Place Trail. The Carrying Place Trail, also known as the Humber Portage and the Toronto Passage, was a major portage route in Ontario which linked the mouth of the Humber River on Lake Ontario to the Holland River near Lake Simcoe. The trail was used by the Wendat, Seneca, and later by the Mississaugas of the Credit River as a transportation and trade route. As a first-generation Canadian and child of immigrants, as I feel like many of you are here, I've struggled to understand my relationship to this land and Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, as all I heard growing up was how grateful we should be for Canada to allowing us to live and work in this country, with no mention of the historical and ongoing colonial violence perpetrated by so-called Canada. I know that as immigrants, it's our duty to stand in solidarity with people fighting genocidal policies and attacks on their sovereignty everywhere, which includes Indigenous peoples here in Canada. Now, LEAP UofT is based in the city called Toronto, and many viewers may have ties to this place. So I guess I'm forced to talk about it. No, I actually want to talk about it. This place we call Toronto has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. The name Toronto has its origins in a word in the Wendat language that refers to a type of dam used for fishing. For millennia, this land was an important gathering place for indigenous peoples to engage in seasonal fishing activities, commerce, and cultural exchange. And for this reason, this word that names our city has taken on other meanings in diverse indigenous languages, meanings such as the gathering place. So even in the name of our city, we can see that this place was and still is an important gathering place for indigenous peoples. This land has been inhabited by the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and Allied Nations. In the Dish with One Spoon, the dish is the land around the Great Lakes with all its resources, and each of us have just one spoon with which to eat. By using the spoon to take only what we need, we leave land and resources for others to enjoy, as we all work together to secure the livelihoods of future generations. Notably, the Dish with One Spoon does not have a knife. Nobody is to cut out a larger portion than they need. There is to be no hoarding of resources or wealth, especially not when others in the community go hungry. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work and reside in this territory. If you'd like to learn more about the Indigenous history of Toronto, an excellent overview was published in issue number 1 of UofT's First Nations House magazine. The link will be posted in the chat with the article beginning on page 4 of the magazine. And you're probably sick of hearing me talk, so to begin our teaching here, Julia and Carmen with an introduction to the Just Recovery.
Thank you, Christine, for that introduction and that acknowledgement. My name's Carmen, everybody. I'm coming to you live from Ithaca, New York, which is Cayuga and Onondaga Nation territory. And I just want to start by saying that, like, when we ask ourselves why we're here, for me, I'm here for a very particular reason. You know, we're all probably in the same, around the same age group. As a young person, in this day and age, it is really hard sometimes to find things to look forward to, especially over the last 4 months. It's hard to find things that make you feel like, yeah, this world is one that I wanna take it and have a great and this plan, the Just Recovery, is like a crack in society, and it's given us a chance to just split it open and really see through it the path to a world that we actually could live in, a world that is fair, a world that is just, and a world that is worth looking forward to. So that's why I'm here. If you want to drop in the chat why you are taking 2 hours of your lit Tuesday night to be with us on Zoom, feel free to drop it in the chat and tell us. But for now, we want to get started. So let me find our speaker notes for this presentation. Yeah, so on a more general level, we're all here as part of the mass movement demanding a just recovery to build back better after this pandemic. So over 400 different organizations have signed on to the 6 principles of what we call the Just Recovery. And we'll discuss those principles in a bit, but first we kind of want to situate ourselves in the current moment. So as you all know, my favorite word, everybody's favorite word really to describe these times is unprecedented times. And we're in the middle of a crisis on multiple levels. It's a pandemic, but it's also an economic crisis. And it is also the cumulative impact of converging economic and social, climate and social crises manufactured over the last few decades by corporate and political elites. So we are here to take this moment and kind of situate UofT and Toronto within this crisis. We want to talk about the roles that we play as students, as activists, as organizers, as faculty and staff and community members in organizing in response to these overlapping crises, especially as reopenings continue, because the narrative already is starting to head towards this idea that we need to be moving back towards normal. But we know better. Normal was not good enough, period. And that is what we're here to talk about. So starting from there, when this crisis hit, 53% of Canadians were already living paycheck to paycheck. 6 million people have already applied for unemployment insurance, and we could go on and list a bunch of statistics at you. But you know, we've all been watching news and hearing these numbers from our friends and neighbors. COVID-19 has touched just about every person in so-called Canada. But the reality is it's not hitting all of us in the same way. It's impacting first and hardest, it is hitting historically and currently marginalized communities. And so that means the elderly in impoverished long-term care facilities. It means migrant farm worker camps where workers lack health coverage or basic worker protections even. You know, as of this week, I think up to 1,000 farm workers in Ontario alone were diagnosed with COVID-19, but have, you know, according to law, they can still be required to keep working even after testing positive. Indigenous communities, another one that often lack running water or clean water and access to broadband internet, and incarcerated people. We could go on. But the idea is COVID-19 is not impacting everyone on the same level. And the connection to climate change could not be more alarming, right? You have fossil fuel companies that have been lobbying hard for relaxed environmental monitoring and using COVID-19 as the excuse somehow. And right-wing politicians like Jason Kenney and Doug Ford are handing them these concessions like on a silver platter. But the question that we wanting to be asking is, when people don't have a place to sleep, when they don't have clean drinking water, when they don't have a safe home, when they don't have a decent space to self-isolate, or a place to live in comfort as they grow old, why are we handing billions of dollars to finance further carbon emissions? So here we are. We get to this point. We cannot go back. We can't go back to what we called normal before the crisis, because normal was not good enough. Like, normal sucked. And how we respond to, recover from, and rebuild after this crisis will likely define the next chapter of human history. But if, you know, that's a big statement to make, that's a heavy burden to put on ourselves. But if we kind of think a few steps ahead, we can plan a powerful force of organizing that can move us toward a just recovery that we need and put us on the path to a Green New Deal. So, big statements. We're going to get there. We're going to break it down. It's going to happen. But before we get into talking about the just recovery, there are a couple things that need to be highlighted to start. So to begin with, there is no just recovery or building back better from COVID-19 without beginning with justice for Black and Indigenous lives. We can't talk about our current moment without recognizing that dismantling white supremacy and colonialism is integral to climate justice and to a just recovery, right? And I know you've all been thinking about this, but although it's common for Canadians to be discussing the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent uprising as a uniquely American issue, the fact is systemic racism is very much alive here in Canada too. In Toronto, Black residents are 20 times more likely to be killed by police than white residents. And in May, many of us were involved with protests that shut down the city after the death of Regis Korchinski-Paquette, who was a Black woman who the police said fell from her balcony after Toronto police arrived at her home. Within the next 2 weeks after that, her death was followed by the murders of Chantel Moore and Rodney Levi, who were both Indigenous people whose wellness checks from the police ended in their violent deaths by gunshot. So the fact is, Black and Indigenous folks in Canada are far more likely to be killed by police than non-Black and non-Native people, because our systems are built on colonialism and white supremacy. But what I think we need to do a better job of highlighting in the climate movement is that this is directly connected to environmental violence. It is because of colonialism and white supremacy that we see more pipelines, more mining, more waste disposal, more heavy industry in Black and Indigenous communities. You know, you've all heard of poisoned drinking water in grassy narrows and poisoned rivers around the Alberta tar sands, higher cancer rates in mining towns. Those are Black and Indigenous communities that have lower life expectancies in Canada as a direct result of environmental violence. And there are generations of activists and scholars and community leaders who have taught us, from the environmental justice movement to Standing Rock to Oka to Wet'suwet'en, we could go on, have taught us that the work of addressing white supremacy is critical to building a climate movement that is rooted in justice. And that is why we use the term climate justice. It means that there's no just recovery for climate without addressing the systemic extraction, dispossession, and violence suffered by Black and Indigenous communities. And none of this information is new, right? It's as old as slavery and settler colonialism. And we invite you to do your own work, particularly white people and non-Black, non-Indigenous people of color. We're providing resources in the slide deck for a good starting place, and we also welcome you to join us in our kind of ongoing process as deep members of learning and unlearning to different extents, perhaps by joining our internal education book club, which meets this week is our next meet. Currently, we're reading essays by Arundhati Roy and Ibrahim Kendi, and we'll be following up after this teach-in with lots of resources. We also, because we have limited time, we invite you to explore the extensive work that's been done on the question of anti-racism in the just recovery, which we will pass on after this webinar. So now I'm going to turn it over to Joe to talk about the steps in a just recovery. This is, everybody, this is Joe's last LEAP event, and we've all been so privileged to organize with her in the last few years. So take it away, Joe.
Thank you for that introduction, Carmen. Yeah, so and thank you for that introduction to this like moment of crisis that we're in. I'm going to talk a bit about what we mean when we say a just recovery, but I'm sure those words already maybe mean something to you or spark ideas in your mind. So if anyone wants to share in the chat what a just recovery means to you, feel free to drop that in there. And I'm going to move on quickly. So we're in this moment where there's already this huge push on the part of the powers that be to try to get us back to normal, which kind of makes everything that Carmen's been saying so far all the more scary. But that's why we need to be thinking of just a few steps ahead, so we can get through this recovery in a way that gets us to the just recovery and the Green New Deal that we need. And I'm just going to show a video from 350.org, kind of outlining what those 3 steps broadly can look like. And yell at me in the chat if the audio doesn't work, please.
There are 2 choices ahead of us. We can either return to a status quo that's destroying the planet for the sake of a wealthy few, or we can leverage this crisis to build a world that works for all of us.
To do so, we, alongside thousands of groups around the world, are calling for a just recovery that puts people before profit.
So how are we going to do it? The only way we are going to win a just recovery is by building a mass, people-powered movement that will fight for it. We are going to need to organize through 3 distinct phases.
First, there's the response. This is the phase that most of us are in right now.
Here, we're responding to the crisis and making sure that people have what they need,
both through mutual aid efforts and by demanding increased government action.
We're also standing up to oil and gas lobbyists and multi-billion-dollar corporations demanding massive bailouts. Soon, we'll move into the recovery phase.
This is when governments will start to reopen the economy and attempt to return us to a normal that has always been deadly and destructive.
During this period, a small corporate elite will be circling like vultures to make billions off the crisis.
They'll sacrifice workers and communities in the name of profit and pressure all levels of government in hopes of lining their pockets with stimulus funding that should be going to everyday people. For us, this is a key phase in the fight for a just recovery. This is the phase where we fight for government action to meet our community's needs instead.
This will lead us into the rebuilding phase. As social distancing is lifted, the wealthy elite and the politicians that serve them will try and claim that we've spent too much over the past months and that we must cut, roll back, and privatize critical public services. For us, this is the time to win the transformative change we need, rebuilding through a made-in-Canada Green New Deal that respects Indigenous rights, creates millions of good jobs, and finally, enshrines dignity and justice for all.
If we can bring together enough of our neighbors and friends and convince them to talk to their neighbors and friends about why we need a just recovery, we can get the ball rolling.
Then we'll take action together, likely starting online, but then moving into the streets to put direct pressure on those in power.
Because let's face it, we all have something to lose because of the climate crisis. and we've all been impacted by coronavirus in some way.
Every single one of us has something to fight for right now. And if enough of us come together, we can win a Green New Deal and finally begin building a world that works for all of us, and not just the wealthy few.
All right. So that video will be shared as part of the set of resources that we sent out. So like they said at the end, please share it widely. So looking ahead to those 3 phases that were outlined in this video, a group of organizations and grassroots leaders have brought together a set of 6 principles for a just recovery here in so-called Canada that we believe can set us on the path towards a Green New Deal. So here they are again in slide deck form. And here are the 6 principles. So the first one, straightforward, putting people's health and well-being first with no exceptions. So this means ensuring that all policies and programs that come out of this are addressing the social, economic, and environmental determinants of health. That means being responsive to the climate emergency, which is, of course, in itself a health crisis. Strengthening the social safety net and providing relief directly to people. So that means instead of encouraging corporate bailouts that are supposed to indirectly help people by restarting the economy, prioritizing redistributive policies and social services that meet people's immediate and long-term needs. Prioritizing the needs of workers and communities. So again, that means bailout packages aren't encouraging unqualified corporate handouts, the rollback of corporate regulations, or regressive subsidies that enrich CEOs. Rather, they're programs that support a just transition away from fossil fuels and create decent work that leaves no one behind. Building resilience to prevent future crises. That means investing in sustainable infrastructure, in public essential services. And building solidarity and equity across communities, generations, and borders. So that means really broadly, recovery plans must be expanding human rights, especially the rights of Indigenous peoples, and advancing gender equity while opposing authoritarian regimes and oppressive systems. And finally, upholding Indigenous rights and working in partnership with Indigenous peoples. So like Carmen has already emphasized, the vast majority of us expect that COVID-19 is going to result in a broad transformation of our society. And the question right now is to whose benefit? So that brings us to UofT. So at LEAP, we've done a lot of, so as Christine mentioned earlier, most of our work is on the fossil fuel divestment campaign. So we've done a lot of work in thinking, how do we think through divestment, a lot of this like financial language through the lens of climate justice. So how do we do more than kind of think about the carbon footprint of our institution, or to use the language that's been talked about tonight about how we can like fix the climate crisis and then get back to the normal of the neoliberal status quo, which obviously is never going to work. And to do that, we like to think about how UofT and post-secondary institutions in general are sitting at this really important nexus in this moment of crisis. We're benefiting from an extractive economy. UofT is a colonial institution on Indigenous land. It's built from extraction and relies on it for continued funds. We are producing knowledge that sustains the extractive economy. And we see the extractive economy perpetuated at the level of students' experience in this culture of constant productivity that helps create a mental health crisis. So that means that, so in doing this work at this nexus, we're constantly dealing with the way that UofT is constantly working to greenwash its image while remaining firmly within this like destructive system. So for example, I'm sure a lot of you heard about when it released its shiny new low carbon action plan and talked about how it was on a path to becoming a net zero institution. But then at the same time, it's continuing to fail to pull its investments from fossil fuels or even reveal how many investments it has. Which avoids addressing the core problem that's placed us in this crisis, which is, of course, the power that corporations and the fossil fuel industry have to profit at the expense of human lives. And let me flip my slide here. At a recent governing council meeting that took place during the pandemic, they reiterated this position. I'm not going to read this whole long quote out, but you can see at this highlighted portion how much this attitude of like working with shareholders and working with the fossil fuel industry sounds so much like governments who are providing corporate bailouts to like work with corporations to get the economy going rather than actually helping people who need to be helped. So given this brand and this history of failing to back up this brand with any kind of concrete responsibility or accountability, tonight we're going to be talking about, and with our panelists, how we read U of T's response to the pandemic. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right now, but if anyone, I'm sure everyone has had experiences related to U of T's response to the pandemic, and that's why we're all here. So if anyone wants to share anything positive, negative, definitely you can slide those into the chat. Just thinking about, you know, how we got this like optional credit, no credit in the Faculty of Arts and Science, which was like an unprecedented measure. But doesn't really address this underlying problem of how grading students during a pandemic is essentially grading them on the privilege and security that they have, but whether or not they're losing their jobs, whether or not they're having to care for family members, whether or not they're even have privacy to get work done. And once you make that observation, you're like, well, wait, wasn't this always the case, if just like to a slightly lesser degree? And what would it look like to have a university that didn't work to cement those pre-existing privileges and oppressive relationships? So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Christine and our panelists.
All right, thank you for that, Julia and Carmen. I hope everyone keeps the 6 principles in mind as we hear from our speakers and move into okay, all right, thanks. Our first speaker of the evening is Diana Barrero, a Latina feminist researcher and educator. She's currently completing her PhD at the University of Toronto with a collaborative specialization in women and gender studies and comparative international and development education. Alongside other graduate students at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, or OISE, and the Faculty of Arts and Science, she has organized several student-led initiatives over the past several months, centering the concerns of graduate students as the university adjusts to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, Diana, the floor is yours for about 10 minutes.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to be sharing my screen, and I'm going to be talking about some of the initiatives that I've been collaborating with other grad students at the university, and as well as a little bit of what the university's response has been. So as Carmen and Julia and Christine have already mentioned, part of what the pandemic has done is that it has amplified and exposed many of the systemic issues that were already existing in our society. And what we've been trying to do at the university through these student-led initiatives is to center the experiences of students, right, around their worries, their concerns, and it's not just for ourselves, but also for our families and communities, and as the university sort of adjusts to the pandemic. Because we know that the University of Toronto can support the well-being of its community, and that includes the students, the staff, and faculty, and that in order for that to be just, right, for a justice-based approach, it needs to take into account equity, and it needs to make equity a priority. And so Julia just mentioned some of the challenges that graduate students, I'm going to be focusing on graduate students, is that, and Julia already mentioned some of them, right? So students are facing financial insecurity, and in particular for groups that are unfunded or beyond the funded cohort, as well as international students. And this comes in the form of loss of income during the summer, but also in the fall and winter, and as well as concerns around the future, right? So what future job prospects are going to look like. And for international students, they haven't been able to access some of the government funds that are available, such as CESB. So that really has left them in a very precarious condition. as well as other barriers to program completion include increasing caregiving responsibilities. And we know that those are racialized and gendered. So women and BIPOC communities are more likely to have taken on additional caregiving responsibilities, as well as things around coursework. So access to technology, access to internet, and for us as graduate students, and particularly for those in research stream programs, the closure of labs, archives, offices, libraries, the travel restrictions that don't allow us to get into our field sites, that has made that we cannot complete our research work. And also issues around our well-being, right? Our mental health and our physical health. And I think one of the things that I want to highlight is that the mental health component is often linked to other things, right? So anxiety around financial issues, feeling isolated because of the not being able to see friends and family, for international students, for not being able to be with their families or travel home. So and I think one of the things that that we were talking around, right? Sort of the fact that, or somebody mentioned in the chat, around how the high tuition, right, has also created a high debt model for students. And those who have been most impacted are marginalized communities, right? So, and it creates barriers for Indigenous students, racialized students, students with disabilities, queer and trans students, and single parents. And I think one of the issues too that students have brought up over the past months is the lack of clear communication from the university at the department and at the faculty level around the response. And so the way I know some of these things is because some of the student-led initiatives that we've been doing include surveys and town halls, as well as letter campaigns, where we've communicated with administration what our concerns are and what we need to feel supported. And I think I want to highlight two points here, is that as students, we've had to organize a lot of these initiatives for a chance to be heard. And this form of unpaid labor takes time away from and energy away from our research. And this pattern kind of mimics the overall university's response to the pandemic, in that it has downloaded the responsibility to individuals. So whether it's students, staff, or faculty, and it hasn't necessarily developed the systemic changes it needs to support this kind of work. And then the other thing that I want to point to is that through this process too, students have communicated to me personally often that they're afraid of approaching the administration directly with their concerns, particularly around administrative issues, out of fear of retaliation. And for me, seeing sort of this culture of fear that is generated, it kind of reminds me of Sarah Ahmed's work around complaint, in that it outlines how individuals are warned not to complain out of fear of being labeled as the problem and then being sort of excluded from future activities. And so this work that we've been doing at OISE and also at the University of Toronto mimics the work that it's being done by other organizations, right? So this is as the results of a survey of undergraduate and graduate students across Canadian universities that the Canadian Alliance of Student Association conducted in the month of May. And it provides a snapshot of the experiences and effects of COVID on students, right? So similar issues around mental health, financial concerns, online courses and access. And the work that we've been doing here at UofT, it sort of forms part of other kinds of graduate student organizing that it's happening both in Canada, but in other places. So across Canada, graduate students have launched petitions at 16 different universities, again, asking for very similar things. Additional funding, right? And that comes in the form of tuition relief for unfunded students, extension of funding packages for funded students, as well as making needs-based funds accessible to students. And the reason why we really emphasize for this, and also automatic extensions. And the reason why we're really asking for automatic extensions is that because at OISE, we know from a survey that was done in 2017 by the Graduate Student Association that almost half of the students who indicated having requested accommodations for either physical disabilities or mental health concerns didn't have their requests met. And so going back to, I think, what Carmen was saying, right? Like the normal, what was happening before was not necessarily working for students. As well as the before, this survey from the RGSA said that international students already felt that their language, cultural, social, and financial needs were not accommodated from by the university. And what we're seeing is that the university's response to COVID has simply sort of amplified that inequality. Other things that we're asking for is for equitable work experiences, as well as protocols that actually protect graduate students when they go back to, with the university's reopening plans. And clear communication around decision-making and the inclusion of students in decision-making. And so some of the, I'm gonna go through a few slides of some of the responses from the university and sort of contrast what the university says and what the university does. So this was what the School of Graduate Studies said on May 15th, after a lot of student departments had been sending letters and approaching their administration. And the university says that it recognizes the impact that this COVID has had on students and that it's both uneven and evolving. And so what we've been asking is for collective solutions, for a systemic approach, for blanket extensions. And what the university does in that same email is state that the response is going to be on a case-by-case individualized approach. And why we've been fighting against this is because it puts students in a vulnerable position in that the student has to approach the university and ask for accommodation and further and increasing the burden on students. And it often results in highly inequitable and responses that lead to support for some students more than for others. And in this, like the gap between what the university says and what the university does is what Sarah Ahmed calls the Institutional Speech Act, in which, and it shows you the way in which institutional power works, where the Speech Act, so what the university says, comes in to stand in for what the action should be. And so another example is that the fact that students are first and foremost, so this is what the university says. Students are first and foremost individuals to whom the university has the duty to mentor, guide, and support. But what it does is that it increased tuition fees by an average of 5.4% for international students, and it can go up to 10%. And what this does, and in part, the university can do this because international student fees are not regulated by provincial legislature. And actually what the spike in tuition increases for international students actually masks the underfunding of post-secondary institutions by both the federal and the provincial governments. And it has shifted the burden to students and their families over the past decades. So here's another. So the university says that it has given students more than $5 million in financial aid. And what it's doing through its processes is often making students jump through hoops to be able to access funds. And often, for many, those funds are not enough. So students have to prove that they've maxed out OSAP, that they've applied for loans, and they have to provide statements for all of this. And often they just get a couple of $100s that won't necessarily meet their needs. And then I think this is my final slides talking about the response from the university, is that the university says that the health and wellness and safety of students are paramount. But what the university did was that a few months ago, it sent an email to students living in the family housing stating that it was going to increase rent by 3.1%. And that is above the provincial guidelines, without taking into consideration what that is going to do, like what that's going to do to students and create further like financial stress. So, and what was interesting was that that email included sort of like, we're gonna be increasing your rent, but we're here to support students. Here's some mental health links. And so again, sort of this connection between the fact that our well-being, it's often tied to these very material things too, right? So financial security being one of them. And I think one of the things that has me most concerned lately is around the province's framework for reopening post-secondary institutions, because in part, there's supposed to be a consultation process happening right now until the end of August. But the university administration has not really engaged in a consultation process with students, staff, or faculty up to this point. So that's really concerning. And I think it emphasizes this point that OCUFA made, so the Ontario Colleges and Universities Faculty Association, around the way in which what the university's response to the pandemic has led to the erosion of democratic, transparent, and accountable practices within Ontario universities.
All right, thank you so much, Diana. Next up, we have Justin Holloway, a member, activist, and steward with USW Local 1998, the largest union of administrative and technical staff at UofT. He's been an administrative staff member at UofT for the past 18 years and holds a Master of Arts in Adult Education and Community Development from OISE. And he's currently planning to pursue his PhD at OISE with a focus on the emerging field of research called Critical University Studies. Right, Justin, the floor, well, virtual floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Hi, thanks very much. Just like to thank the organizers of this event for asking me to speak about a UofT just response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Just briefly say again that I'm a USW staff appointed member at UofT. I have been for 18 years working in administration here. I've served with the UofT steelworkers as a steward, a chief steward, a health and safety member, committee member, a bargaining member. So I've really been active with the union here, the USW, the largest union. And I have particular fields of research that may interest this particular audience. Critical university studies and the Canadian social economy both have a lot to do with sort of where we are in this crisis, being community members at UofT. I think I was going to talk about critical university studies and about the social economy. I might come back to that if I have time. But I do want to kind of jump right into some of the questions that were raised, about the COVID-19 response, the university's handling of it. Like one of the questions being raised is sort of who has the university left behind in all this? Who have they stranded during COVID-19? And I guess start off with a little bit of a controversial answer to that question. I don't think the university's stranded anyone. We have to be really careful with our words here, or else we'll let people off the hook who shouldn't be let off the hook. The university doesn't do anything. It isn't anything except really a word that evokes certain images and thoughts and feelings in our minds, etc. It's a bit of a linguistic argument I'm making here, but the university hasn't done anything. It's like applying an anthropomorphism instead of actually naming who's doing what to whom. So that means like imbuing human characteristics in inanimate objects, like the university, essentially, a collection of buildings and books, but we need to talk about the people. So it's important to speak clearly in this regard, pretty clearly. The senior administration's response, not the university, but the senior administration's response, Merrick Gertler, Cheryl Reguer, etc., to the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare that this group of people, the senior administration at U of T, might be, either dangerously incompetent or their power and authority might be illegitimate. Because they've left behind and stranded their actual constituents, the students, faculty, and staff, support staff at the university, and left them basically without having any meaningful say about their concerns during the pandemic. There was a recent example of this that was cited by a group of 19 prominent scholars from the U of T's Dalai Lama School of Public Health. These are the public health experts at U of T, basically lamenting how they've been left behind too, by the senior administration, not by the university, but by that group against this group. All of these people are professors. They excoriated the fact that they've only, quote, been scantily consulted. And again, these are the U of T's own public health experts. They've called for the 50 or so worker-led joint health and safety committees to be immediately consulted and utilized as intended. And that's great because that shows solidarity and allyship between the actual constituents of the university, students, faculty, and staff. University managers right now are only now in the middle of July sending out staff surveys when the planning for the return to campus is in the final stages, or in many cases, most likely has already been finalized. This is pretty incredible. This is pretty incredible because they've just assumed, the senior administration has assumed the facts, the fears, the concerns of an entire community. And then you have more broadly the essential working groups on campus, the campus unions and associations, USW, QP, UTFA, the Faculty Association, uniting and putting out a joint statement saying that the health and safety of community members is in jeopardy due to the same lack of meaningful consultation, and especially, again, the freezing out of the joint health and safety committees, which are located, 50 of them are located across the 3 campuses and have a vitally important role in helping to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic, or they should, and its effects on community members. It's inexplainable why the senior administration suddenly think that they're the health and safety experts. Why they suddenly assume to know everything there is about the lived experience of frontline staff, except if you chalk it up to a pretty simple calculus. Their primary objective here is obviously towards ensuring the main revenue stream, high-priced tuition, is unharmed and can continue to be the goose that lays golden eggs. So according to this logic, you can't have an elite institution without elite price tags. I think anyone with any familiarity with studying at U of T has a knowledge of that. Merrick Gertler gave an interview in 2018 with the BBC, expressly laying out that was the position of the university to make it more elite through charging more. So it's not a conspiracy, though, that this is sort of how the senior administration operates, you know, to beat back the participation of anyone who would challenge these policies or their power. That's just kind of how power works. You know, I do also want to mention, like, these plans that have already been developed with no consultation to the to especially the frontline workers, who are probably the most at risk, because, you know, they're seeing countless students, countless faculty, countless staff. I just like to make a point about how, you know, these plans are incredibly important for their obviously to protect and uphold their health, and the university knows that this is an extremely risky proposition if they're going to even slowly start bringing workers and students back to campus. But I guess it's worth the risk to them. It's extremely risky. There's Professor Richard Wolff, who teaches at the New School in New York City, who makes a good point, I think, that without a massive testing regimen in place in these massive public universities, like U of T is a city within a city. So it's highly likely that, you know, if there's a COVID second wave, or even, you know, a resurgence of the first, that it's going to happen in a scenario where U of T opens up too quickly or without the appropriate precautions. There needs to be a concrete, you know, testing plan in place, because the risks are just too high. And that doesn't mean that managers, which is, I think, the plan right now, say, you know, oh, probably stay home if you're sick, or figure out a time to go get tested. If we're going to have campus life again, which is what they're headed towards, then we have to have accessible, you know, frequent testing right on campus. Like, none of this really has been put in place. We have members that are frontline members who've been working throughout the pandemic who haven't received a single mask. These are essential workers who haven't, to this date, received a single piece of PPE from the university, but are expected to work the front lines and maintain the essential services and work that's required by the university. So the unions have had to step up and purchase their own. So that, you know, all of these things, all of these examples are examples of how the university has, you know, not the university, excuse me, the senior administration has completely left behind their constituents. You know, what should they be doing? Well, from a labor perspective, and that's where I hail from, you know, the university needs to guarantee salary continuance and job security throughout the entire pandemic, which they haven't done. They shouldn't be laying people off. You know, all the metrics show that there's massive negative implications for people personally, their families, society at large, when workers are cast aside during a crisis. You know, and a place as privileged and as wealthy as U of T shouldn't be fueling this like they've already done. Right now, labor-wise on campus, USW 1988 and QP have had 185 service workers temporarily laid off, many in jobs like food service workers, parking attendants, and the athletics and facilities services. But we've also had, in terms of our most precarious workers, which are the casual unit, these are people who generally are contract workers, have really no job security to speak of. Well, you know, during a pandemic, when we know it's critically important not to lay people off, that unit has been absolutely devastated. At the end of May, our figures reported that we had lost over 700 of these workers at U of T. These people are essentially disappeared by U of T because we don't even get you know, up-to-date you know, figures on hirings and firings, etc. We just basically get a total and then have to compare it to you know, years past and whatnot. So, you know, it's just it's such a precarious environment that U of T, you know, basically calls flexible labor, or whatever you want to call it. But like all of that should be cast aside, just blanket. You can't be doing this during a pandemic. Like losing one's job at any time is devastating, but losing one's job during a pandemic is absolutely outrageous. So what's USW and the campus unions been doing? Like my union, we've been primarily trying to fill the void left for us by the communication void left for us by the university, by regularly informing our members, keeping them as abreast as possible of the news and information related to the pandemic's effects on our workers and our membership. We've also been even hiring faculty and student researchers to help conduct a massive survey we're working on to try to actually figure out what are the fears and concerns of our members and to address them. As I mentioned, we've been purchasing and distributing our own PPE because the university has not lived up to their basically their obligation to do so. We've ramped up our health and safety capacity by hiring an additional coordinator, and just also trying to accelerate our coalition building through having members involved in numerous campus groups at every time, but especially during this time. And I'll give a shout out to the Divestment and Beyond Coalition. That's one that has a few key USW members, and they've been doing great work. So I'm just going to leave it at that in terms of my comments. And if people visit Divestment and Beyond UofT.ca, you can see more information about that coalition.
All right, thank you so much, Justin. And the last speaker in our lovely lineup is Anjum Sultana, founder of Millennial Women in Policy, a grassroots community of practice that connects more than 3,000 young women and non-binary people working in policy across North America and Europe. Anjum holds a Master's of Public Health from the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And recently, Anjum was appointed to the Civic Action Task Force, which feeds into and advises various COVID-19 recovery tables throughout the Greater Toronto region.
Great. Thank you so much, first of all, for the invite. And it's actually such a pleasure to be back at among friends at UofT. I was there for my undergrad. I studied at the Scarborough campus, and then I did, oh, you can't see my screen. Right now, it's still my face, but I will pull up my screen shortly. Yeah, so but I appreciate, because you just wanted to make sure I knew, so I appreciate that. Yeah, and I just wanted to say, you know, what I really appreciate about Just Recovery is that it provides this bold vision. And right now, we need that bold vision to build back better and really reimagine what we could do. You'll find there will be detractors who will want you to water down, but really I encourage you to stay true to your principles, because that is how we're going to have a better future. You know, there is always this pressure between incrementalism and radical shifts. I think this moment is showing us, you know, earlier Carmen was talking about that crack that has opened during this crisis. Take full advantage. The policy window is there. So don't let people stop you from realizing that full vision, because that can happen, and right now is the moment not to do that, because there's so much happening in terms of possibilities. So right now I'll just share my screen. So again, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm wearing many hats, but I'm here in my capacity through Millennial Women in Policy, and we're actually one of the signatories to the Just Recovery Principles. So if you scroll on their website, we have signed on because I think what it offers is a bold vision. What I'm hoping to do today over the next 10 minutes, because I want to make sure I adhere to your timelines, is talk about specifically the gendered impacts of COVID-19, the pandemic, not just the health crisis, because actually what's interesting is in Canada compared to some other countries around the world, we're actually seeing women being health-wise impacted more from COVID-19. And also, unfortunately, with respect to the deaths of COVID-19, there is also a slight gendered impact. And part of it is because we've seen dramatic impacts in long-term care homes, and people who are there are perhaps the population skews a bit older, but also people who identify as women. So that's part of the reason some are contemplating why that's happening. But it is interesting that Canada is actually a bit different from other countries around the world in that regard. So I want to talk a bit about the health impacts. I want to talk a bit about the economic impacts, but I also want to talk about the social impacts. In my day job, we've been talking a lot, in addition to a just recovery, what does a feminist economic recovery plan look like that actually centers and talks about the economy alongside gender equity and gender justice. And I think all of these plans that are coming out that are talking about this progressive future are all complementary. They're all additive. They're all hopefully realizing that better future for us all. So I hope my comments here I offer humbly as food for thought, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that comes after. So I mentioned a bit about what I want to talk about. So I want to kind of zoom out a bit, coming from a public health background, but someone who also in my day job works more nationally and also internationally. What we're seeing is that across the globe, the global health workforce is predominantly comprised of women. They're on the front lines. So over 70% of global health workers across the globe, and even Canada, you'll see, are women. So they're on the front lines doing this incredibly difficult and challenging work. And as one of my panelists talked about, without personal protective equipment, without the basics that they need. But, if we're talking about where priorities are, it's interesting to see that, if there was a war, for example, if there's military action, somehow we can find the resources to protect people or to hurt people, if you think about actually what militarization has done in terms of where money is actually spent. But when it comes to saving lives and saving the workers who are saving lives, somehow the funds aren't there. So it really just shows again that reoccurring theme of where are the priorities. In Canada, kind of zeroing now on where we are, over 50% of women workers work in something called the 5 Cs. So what are the 5 Cs? So the 5 Cs are occupations. Many are essential occupations, essential workers, essential jobs, who work in roles such as in clerical, in catering, in cashiering, cleaning, as well as caring. And I think that's really important, caring. At the start of this conversation, people are talking about mutual aid. We've talked about the healthcare system, social policy, right? How supports, financial supports, for example, by different institutions, including the federal government, are essential. But I think at the core of it is how we care for each other and how we care for society and the planet. So, if I can leave you with one kind of call to action, is always lean towards care in all its forms. And that's where you'll see the answer from a policy perspective, but also on a micro level as well. So kind of to break down the different essential occupations, we see 90% of nurses identify as women, 75% of respiratory therapists, 80% of those working in medical labs, and 90% of personal support workers. And, I come to this right now, I'm focusing on gender, but truly, we have to think about it from an intersectional perspective, like who are these women? Two things I want to say. One, when I use the term intersectional or intersectionality, I think it's important to note who came up with that term. Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar who was talking about not just looking at, for example, the experiences of Black women in the legal and law space, but talking about how it's not just additive. It's not just like add race plus gender plus sexual orientation plus another aspect of someone's social location. It's all of those things together. And then also, how it creates both marginalization but privilege and how they interact. So definitely want to make sure that that is named and who has come up with that term. And I think also I'll say, and this is, the challenge of Canada, and sometimes in some respects the US is better, we don't actually have disaggregated data across many aspects of society when it looks at things like race. So we can make some, estimations based on some smaller data, but we don't actually do that on a large scale. We're starting to because of advocates and organizers like you, but we need to do more. And I would hope, when you're thinking about just recovery on campus, what does that look like around race-based or disaggregated data? I think there's a role to play, because if you don't know where the inequities lie, you're not able to hold people accountable. And often there's such resistance to it because they know once there's data, hardcore facts, which people already know, but the numbers attached to it, then you can see better change. So when it comes to work, for example, important measures have been, and people are still advocating for, and Just Recovery talks about this, paid sick leave, personal protective equipment, hazard pay, and minimum wage increases. So I'd say for everyone here who's thinking about how you can play a role on campus, advocating for this at multiple orders of government, but also making sure that when the university contracts with some sort of institution on campus, such as caterers, do they have the policies that you want in place? Can you make that a requirement of how vendors are selected? There's this whole idea of social procurement, how, you know, a corporation, which, you know, UofT is legally speaking, is actually using its funds. So I think, you know, we do a lot of work and talk a lot about how we need to do social procurement, targeting business and contracts towards equity-seeking groups. So I think that's something you can explore at the various different parts of UofT, because it's so expansive, the different campuses, the different colleges, how social procurement can play a role, because that's something that is in line with the Just Recovery. I think I also want to mention a bit that the upcoming and the current recession that we're in and are starting to go into deeper, some are arguing is called a she-session, economist Armin Yelnazine. You know, I have a couple stats here, but I don't want to belabor the point. But I think one thing I want to pull out, coming back to my public health experience, is the social determinants of health. Having a good job is important for your health, your safety, your self-esteem. It impacts so much of who you are. And I say work in a more broad sense, because I would say unpaid and paid work. You know, there might be jobs that you do for wages, but there's other important intellectual labor and emotional labor that people are doing that are also important and critical. But I think, you know, thinking about yourselves, what does the economy look like post-COVID? We're already seeing dramatic job losses for women. A recent report by RBC Economics talked about 1.5 million women lost their jobs in March and April. We're seeing that many of the jobs that people lost were in sectors such as retail, food services, accommodations, hospitality, tourism, and it's unclear if those jobs are going to come back. So I think we need to have a real plan for how do we actually start to invest in the parts of the economy that are more resilient to change. And I would say, again, going back to my first part, what has really saved us in this crisis is care. If I were to give you a high level number, right now in the world, there's 2.1 billion people that need care. 2.1 billion people. This could look like childcare, it could look like elder care, many different forms. But there's less than 300 million workers globally who actually provide that care, who do paid care work. And so what happens to the rest of the people that are not served or supported in their care needs? Often what happens is unpaid care work happens. And that care work is taken on and distributed unevenly, typically around gender and racial lines. And so we're seeing again, sometimes, you know, that service is critical. It's still getting done. People are still doing the work. They're just not getting paid. And so we have to really talk about how do we do public investments in care to really ensure that important labor is distributed more evenly and compensated appropriately. And you know, I think on campus, I'm sure this conversation has come up. I remember when I was there around mental health services. So again, this is yet another aspect of the care economy or the care infrastructure that supports us all. So I'd say on campus, if you're thinking about how do you talk about the care economy, I think mental health is a good place to start. I'm gonna let's just see. Okay, I'm gonna kind of go quickly through the slides, but I'm happy to share this afterwards if people are interested, and hopefully in the Q&A I can share a bit more. I think another aspect that we're seeing gendered impacts, but also I would say on campus to really make sure you're taking a look at is around gender-based violence across the globe, and even in Canada, and even in the work that I do outside of my work with Millennial Women in Policy, we're seeing increases in domestic violence on the order from 20 to 50%. And this is actually really scary, what's happening. Part of it comes from aspects of society like patriarchy, sexism. I see a comment. I'm sure the comment is for me to continue. Hold on, sorry. Let me just see. Oh, okay, great. Thank you. So this is something I would say think about what is your role as part of the campus community, because this dramatically impacts people's ability to have a safe and secure life. And sometimes there is an intersection with housing and affordability. So I think also thinking about, what is the price for actually staying on campus, right? If someone wanted to live on residence, is there some organizing that could be done around that to make that more accessible, especially for international students, let's say? I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle. I think something else that has been critical, and again, it's a form of care, for my opinion, is around the social safety net. And that is one of the principles of the just recovery. So think about some of the social safety net pieces we've seen come out during this crisis. Employment insurance, people have dipped into that. The thing is, that's really hard for people with precarious work to access. And so we have to fight for better employment insurance, where you don't have to work, basically full time to get access to it. It should be something that is eligible to part-time workers, because every single time you go into work and you get a paycheck, you're paying into it. So why is it that you don't get access to it? Something that you have contributed to. And it's something also that has very gendered impacts as well. There's been other benefits here. So I'd say, I put this slide just to say two things. One, figure out what is not working with these potential social safety net mechanisms for you and your community at UofT and the people you work with. But also think about, look at how quickly people were able to come up with all of these different benefits. When people tell you that you can't pay for it, it's not possible, it's not feasible, think about what we were able to do in a pandemic. I know all of you know this, but this is to just reiterate. It's oftentimes a lack of imagination or will that prevents us from doing things, not actual feasibility. And so I'd say kind of hammering home the point, care in all its forms is essential to this recovery, so please don't forget. And I'd also say something that you can use as a roadmap, and my fellow panelists have mentioned this, I would say the social determinants of health. What creates a healthy and happy life? That's typically probably the things we should invest in more and prioritize. So things like income security, housing, good working conditions, those are all areas that will have immense impact. And if you ever need, I can provide you all the scientific literature that tells this is true, but we also know it in our hearts. Sometimes data just validates what we already know. So you utilize that as a tool, but also, staying grounded in what you know intuitively is also really, really important. And I say this as a researcher, it's really important to always keep those two things in mind, because sometimes knowledge is kind of appropriated or kind of divvied up when some of the knowledge we kind of already know inherently. And so I guess the last thing I'll end on, and so this is a bit more broader strokes, but I think just to give you food for thought, and something I would hope your colleagues at UofT also think about at a UofT level, but also broader in society. Take a look at how they're actually structuring their economic policies and fiscal policies right now. When you look at the country of Canada, monetary policy or policies around like what is the overnight interest rate and all these different things, sometimes they seem like, oh, it's just benign, it's an economic measure so we can be more stable financially as a society. But what it actually does, it creates inequities. And sometimes the benefits are applied unfairly, unevenly, and actually might create more harm than good. So really consider how all of that is playing out at UofT, but just broadly. And then also budget cuts, right? We just went through a crisis, so it makes sense that people will say we need to cut back, we need to balance the books. Austerity measures might be taken, but really, really resist that, because again, when things like austerity measures happen, we've seen this in many parts of the world, and we've seen this in Canada even as well. The people who are hardest hit are the people who need to be centered. So really, really thinking about resisting that, because if we're thinking about equity and inclusion, this will do a dramatic hit. And I think what I'll do is just end on this slide. I think hopefully I've given you a lot of food for thought. I welcome you to engage with me and connect with me, and I love to talk to UofT students as a past UofT student. But I really think the great work that you're doing is amazing, and I hope you continue it, and let me know if I can ever be of support. I'm always here to lend a hand or support any way I can. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjum. Yes, we will probably stay in contact if we have any other cool events coming up and we want you to speak, because I want to hear more of what you have to say. Sorry, we only gave you 10 minutes. Anyways, it's after 6 p.m., but I think it's time for our 5-minute break. I know my back hurts from sitting down for so long. During the 5-minute break, our tech mod Maya will be dispersing everyone into breakout rooms during the break. So don't be alarmed if you come back after 5 minutes and you're suddenly in a different room. Before we leave, here is an overview of the breakout groups. Each group will have a facilitator or multiple, depending on how the division works, and these facilitators will have some suggested discussion questions prepared. Feel free to discuss multiple or only one principle as a group. All the facilitators have access to all the questions. When we come back as a larger group, each group will have 3 to 4 minutes for a report back, so be sure to pick a representative to speak. And when we come back from the groups, it'll be time to talk about how we can connect the principles we talked about, the insights from our panelists, all in organizing on campus. If you have any further questions, drop them in the chat over the break and we'll get to them before we get started.